of burning, and it means I have to have sexual release of some kind.
In 1954, the young couple left Germany for America, where Albert's sexual problems soon caught up with him.
When Albert returned to the United States, to New Jersey, he had brushes with the law. The most serious one was an arrest in Mount Holly, New Jersey in January of 1955 for carnal abuse of a child.
The charges were dropped when the girl's mother decided the court proceedings would be too traumatic for the child. Albert decided it was a good time to leave town. In 1956, Albert, Irmgard, and their new baby daughter packed up and left New Jersey and the Army altogether. Their destination, Boston. Within years, Albert would begin his downward spiral into a psychotic world of sexual deviation and violence. At the age of 25, Albert DeSalvo was fighting an internal battle against his own monstrous sexual cravings, and he was losing. But he still strained to live the normal working-class life in Boston with his wife Irmgard and their baby girl.
He was very firm about the fact that he was a devoted husband and father. He never went out with the guys for a beer after work. He came straight home. He gave his entire pay packet to Irmgard. He was never one for a night out on the town.
Albert grabbed whatever job he could find, in a shoe factory, then in a shipyard, and finally as a construction worker. By 1960, Albert and Irmgard had their second child, a son. But Albert was restless.
He wanted to be something in life and just didn't have the background, training, education, experience, or the wherewithal to become anyone except a loudmouth, self-centered, egotistical braggart.
And a sexual predator. Albert had begun to prowl the streets of Cambridge searching for his prey. He invented a routine to con gullible young women, relying heavily on his ability to charm.
A man claiming to be a representative of a black and white modeling agency, he called himself Johnson, was appearing at the doors of various young women and saying, "You're lovely, you should be a model, may I take your measurements?"
That man was Albert DeSalvo.
He would then say that he was empowered to take their measurements to see if they would fit the photographer's needs, and that he was allowed to give $10 for just their measurements, or $15 in bra and pants, or $25 in the nude.
A surprising number of women went along with Albert's scheme. It was not uncommon for Albert to then talk his way into bed with the most trusting of his prey. But some of the women complained to the police. The cops started keeping a watch out for the con artist they called the Measuring Man. Meanwhile, Albert was branching out. He was fast becoming an expert at breaking and entering. And luck was on his side. Although he was arrested and charged with burglary several times, he always received a suspended sentence and walked out of court. Until March 17th, 1961. That night, Albert was caught while burglarizing a house on Broadway in Cambridge. DeSalvo had every reason to once again expect easy treatment at the hands of the law. But this time, he himself changed the rules. On the way back to the station house, Albert boasted to the police about his many sexual conquests, explaining in detail the unusual scheme he'd cooked up to con women as the Measuring Man.
I gave a fast line. I said, well, if you give me your measurements now, I'll cut them strip right down naked. And I told her, if you really want to make out, I said, I'll come down myself first thing this afternoon, and I'll take care of you. I'll make sure that you get first prize.
The police were delighted with Albert's unsolicited confession. They arrested him for the Measuring Man assaults, and they threw the book at him, charging him with breaking and entering, assault and battery, and lewdness. But the judge softened the blow. He dropped the charge of lewdness and allowed DeSalvo to plead guilty only to the burglary and assault charges, an act of leniency that would have serious consequences later. To Albert, it didn't seem lenient at all. For the first time in his life, Albert had to go to prison, the Billerica House of Corrections. His sentence was just 11 months. In April 1962, Albert was once again a free man. It was 2 months later that the first victim of the Boston Strangler, Anna Slessors, was found dead. For the next 18 months, the Strangler's string of grisly murders terrorized Boston and the whole nation. But the police never suspected Albert DeSalvo. Because the judge had not charged him with sexual offenses for the Measuring Man crimes, Albert's name did not come up when the Strangler Task Force combed the police files for suspects. In fact, DeSalvo might never have been connected to the Boston Stranglings at all if it hadn't been for his insatiable sexual appetite. In May of 1964, 5 months after the last known Boston Strangling, Albert began a series of rapes in Massachusetts. These crimes would earn him yet another nickname, the Green Man.
The Green Man scheme was somewhat, well, considerably different from his Measuring Man gig. He got the name Green Man from the fact that he wore a workman's uniform.
He would drive somewhere, and the urge would be on him. That's the only way he explained it. And he would park wherever there's a place to park. Then he would go in the building, and he would look at the bells. And if there's a name of a woman, he would simply press the bell.
He would say, there's a leak, or the superintendent has sent me around to turn off your water so that we can check out the leak in the basement. And of course there would be no leak, but the woman would admit him to the house. He would then bind her and sexually assault her.
I don't think it made any difference to Albert who answered. Some were old, some were young. I think his criteria was that a woman answered when he rang the bell.
Sometimes he would apologize to his victims. When he would tie them up, he would spread eagle them on a bed, and then he'd kiss them about the body and then do other things.
4 victims of the Green Man went to the police. And even though DeSalvo was not recorded as a sex offender, one cop with a good memory remembered that as the Measuring Man, Albert had been accused of sex crimes. The police told Albert to come in for questioning. Instead, Albert fled to his brother's house.
He says, I'm going to be arrested. I says, well, what? What did you do? And he says, I've done some things. I says, what did you do? And he just started to cry.
It was then that Albert made a startling confession to his sister-in-law about a break-in gone bad.
He says, I did harm to somebody. I says, what are you talking about? He says, I'm responsible for your woman dying. I said, what old woman? What are you talking about? He says, I broke in a house, he says, and I scared the woman. She died of a heart attack.
The woman Albert was referring to was 85-year-old Mary Mullen. She had indeed been found dead of a heart attack in her home, but there had been no evidence of foul play, and Mullen's death was never considered a homicide. Now, Albert brought his brother Richard and Richard's family home with him. When they arrived at Albert's house, the police were already there waiting.
Something's going down. I says, you know, how come everybody's all of a sudden look at your car? So he says, well, I think this is it. I think they're going to arrest me. Then he started picking up speed.
He ended up driving on the wrong side of the street, half on the street, half on the sidewalk. He was hitting no parking signs, stuff like that there.
My husband says, you know, you can't do this. Cops are everywhere. So that's when he pulled over.
He says, you stay here, and he got out and he started running.
The chase continued on foot, but Albert's politeness kicked in. When one of the cops dropped his gun, Albert stopped running, found it, and handed it back to the officer. The cop showed his appreciation by cuffing him. When questioned by police, Albert confessed to several of the Green Man rapes. The judge in the case found the confessions disturbing enough that he sent Albert to a mental hospital for observation. There, Albert would meet another mental patient named George Nasser. As usual, Albert could not help bragging about his exploits.
He was constantly talking about what his crimes were.
While talking to George Nasser, Albert would confess for the first time that he was the Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo began the fall of 1964 at the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. He had been arrested for a series of rapes in Cambridge called the Green Man crimes. The judge had sent him to the hospital to determine if Albert was competent to stand trial. As far as the psychiatrists were concerned, he was.
I diagnosed Albert as a sociopath. A major characteristic was he was manipulative, not above committing crimes to get what he wanted. But there were also aspects, he was terribly insecure. He wanted to be the most important person in the world.
Declared competent, Albert was sent back to jail, but not for long. In jail, Albert announced he was having visions of his wife appearing and berating him for his crimes. So the judge promptly sent Albert back to the mental hospital. This time, the psychiatrist decided to label him incompetent. Then suddenly, Albert started talking like he never had before.
He bragged so much nobody believed him. As a matter of fact, he was found out only because he bragged to his cellmate, George Nasser, who was very bright.
Nasser, who was in the mental hospital awaiting trial for murder, became Albert's confidant.
He just wanted to know, what could a person do to help himself and his family if he had a series of terrible crimes to confess to and didn't want to be simply buried in the system, but wanted treatment for his crimes and wanted help for his family.
According to Nasser, the terrible crimes Albert was hinting at were the Boston Stranglings. Nasser told Albert he would mention the problem to his own attorney, the famous young defense lawyer F. Lee Bailey. Bailey was intrigued by Albert's veiled admissions, but jailhouse confessions to unsolved crimes are quite common and often invented. So Bailey wanted some proof that Albert was telling the truth.
To see if DeSalvo knew what only the killer could know, and no one could memorize if the real killer had told him.
Bailey went to the Boston police and asked for detailed questions on the Stranglings, questions he could use to quiz Albert.
We gave him probably 25 questions that, as far as we knew, were pretty much just secreted in our organization. They certainly were never printed in the newspapers or was on television.
When Bailey arrived at the mental hospital with the list of Strangler questions for Albert, George Nasser was present as the meeting started.
Bailey then pulled open a folder and asked Al a question. It was something like, what was under the sofa of Mrs. So-and-so's apartment? And Al said something like, it was a pink and blue scarf, silk scarf. And that's when I said, I'm leaving.
Bailey checked Albert's answers with the Boston police, who told him Albert had passed the test with flying colors. Now Bailey was sure he was dealing with the real Boston Strangler. He called Albert's wife Irmgard and told her. Irmgard packed up their belongings and left with the children. Albert never saw his family again. But when his brother Richard came to visit him, Albert told Richard he had great plans for the future.
The way he explained it was he was going to admit to something that was going to make him famous and rich. He would be able to have books and movies and so many different things, and there'd be so much money involved that he would even own the hospital, the mental hospital that he'd be in.
F. Lee Bailey signed on as Albert's lawyer. His top priority from that point on was to keep his client out of the electric chair. So Bailey cut a deal with the authorities. Albert would confess only if the court ruled him insane from the very start. But word was getting around that someone was confessing to the Boston Stranglings. State Attorney General Edward Brooke decided to take control.
I filed a petition in the Supreme Judicial Court asking for a restraining order against F. Lee Bailey.
Brooke had the court appoint Albert a legal guardian. Bailey was allowed to stay on as Albert's attorney, and the state agreed that in exchange for the confessions, Albert's words could not be used against him.
All his admissions were given under guardianship, therefore they were absolutely inadmissible in a criminal case without a waiver on his part.
The police planned to corroborate the confessions with physical evidence and then prosecute Albert. The interrogation of Albert DeSalvo was now ready to begin. Albert described the murder of Nina Nichols, victim number 2, as he pointed to a diagram of her apartment.
I was right here.
And you grabbed it.
Grabbed it right here.
Right, and fell back on the bed.
When she fell back, right?
Yes.
I was in this position here. Right here. Right, and my feet went right around her and crossed over this way here.
Crossed around her waist?
No, it brought me her legs.
Right. You really had a pin there.
I don't even like to talk about this.
Then Albert claimed his sexual urges overwhelmed him.
As soon as I saw the back of her head, right? Not her face. Didn't see nothing but the back of her head, right?